Well, good morning. It's really an honor to be here with you today. We've got another minute left of morning, and I'll try not to go too long into the afternoon, of course. I especially want to welcome those of you who might be visiting today. We are really glad you're coming, that you're here. Glad you came. And I was asked to speak on the question, is there a God? And you know, I'm used to speaking to audiences who differ with what I have to say. And so, of course, please feel free to agree or disagree with what I'm saying. I don't come to force my views down your throat or coerce you to believe as I do, but really just to get you to think. And today to think about this important question, is there a God? And I hope we'll have a lot of fun too. Now, some of you may suspect from the outset that you're going to end up agreeing with what I have to say. And I hope that what you hear can provide some useful ideas for your own worldview and also your conversations with others. Now, as I was preparing to speak on this topic, I began to think, how would I feel and what would I be thinking if I were visiting this church for the first time, sitting out there in the audience and didn't really know much about this guy and what he was going to say. He said his subject was, is there a God? So let's see, I'm sitting there in the audience with you. Here's what I wonder. Let me think. We're in a church. It's a Christian church. There are Bibles everywhere. There's a huge picture of Jesus on the window behind the speaker. People are singing hymns to God. They're praising God. Let me see, how is he going to answer this question, is there a God? You know, I have a sneaking suspicion he's going to say yes. And you would be correct. But what I'd like to do is explain to you, because I wasn't always this sure that God existed. And I'd like to explore with you today how I came to decide whether or not God existed. I had heard about him. I'd never seen him. And I wondered if it was just wish fulfillment. You know, my undergraduate degree is in psychology. My graduate work is about dealing with Sigmund Freud. And I thought maybe it's just wish fulfillment. Maybe people really want to believe that it's true, and so they convince themselves it's true. I wanted evidence, though. I didn't want just wish fulfillment. There were two little boys, young brothers, who were always getting into trouble, and their parents thought maybe they could get the preacher to come over to the family home and talk some sense into them. So the minister came over to the home, and he decided he wanted to talk to each boy separately. So they had the older brother upstairs in the bedroom that they shared with each other, and the younger brother was downstairs, the little boy, and the minister started talking to him, and he said, "Son, where is God?" The little boy was petrified. Looked like he was scared to death. The minister said it again, raising his voice, "Son, where is God?" No response. Finally, the minister got a little bit louder and he said, "Son, where is God?" And at that point, the little boy bolted upstairs and opened the door to his bedroom and said to his older brother, "We're in big trouble. God's missing and they think we did it." Where is God? By the way, can you hear okay in the back? Raise your hand if you can hear okay. Okay, good. A few people in the back weren't laughing, thought they didn't. Where is God? First up, I'd like to talk about some evidence related to creation and conscience. Creation and conscience. Consider what one former skeptic, actually a persecutor of first century believers, had to say. His name was Paul. And he used to throw followers of Jesus in jail. He applauded when one of them, Stephen, was being stoned to death. That's the kind of guy he was. But by his own claim, his life changed dramatically when he had an encounter with Jesus, whom he believed had been raised from the dead. And he dedicated himself to promoting the faith he once tried to destroy. In a letter to some friends in Rome, he noted two arguments for God's existence: the creation of the universe and human moral conscience. First, creation. He wrote that people know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. In other words, he was saying the majesty and the complexity of the universe bear witness to God's existence. Now, let's imagine that you're looking at a very beautiful Rolex watch. Here's a picture of a Rolex watch. And let's imagine that you see this watch in the gutter, and you start thinking, how did this watch come into being? Did rain wash along the gutter, and there were random bits of dirt and water and plastic and metal, and all of a sudden from this debris there sprang this ornate watch? Is that how it happened? Probably not. Probably you would conclude that very likely the watch's design indicated that an intelligent, skilled person had designed it. So the design of the earth and sky bear witness to a designer, Paul argued. Paul also mentioned that human moral conscience was important, awareness of right and wrong. He wrote, even the Gentiles, that is, folks who are not Jews, even the Gentiles who do not have God's written law, show that they know His law when they instinctively obey it, even without having heard it. They demonstrate that God's law is written in their hearts, for their own conscience and thoughts either accuse them or tell them they are doing right. Now, of course, moral codes differ between people, cultures, countries, but many people, if they're honest with themselves, seem to have an innate sense of right and wrong on certain issues. People will generally understand that things like telling the truth and showing kindness and forgiving are right. There are exceptions. And that lying and theft and murder are wrong. Where does this inner sense, awareness of right and wrong, come from? Paul saw it as evidence that God had created humans in His own image, with personalities and with a conscience. Creation and conscience. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant famously wrote, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The oftener, or we would say more often and more steadily, we reflect on them. Two things, the starry heavens above and the moral law within." The starry heavens above and the moral law within. Now, as significant as creation and conscience are, those arguments for God, frankly, were not convincing to me. I was a skeptic, and I needed something more before I could confidently believe that He existed. The Scottish agnostic philosopher David Hume had what I feel is a valid criticism of the argument from design, valid from a human perspective, I should say. He said the universe's design may evidence a designer, but that doesn't prove that the designer was the all-knowing, all-powerful biblical God. Could have been a lesser being, like maybe a demigod, more intelligent and powerful than humans, but not an infinite supreme being. I felt he had a good point. So let me outline the reasoning that led me to conclude that God exists. First, let's take a look at atheism and agnosticism. Atheism and agnosticism. Atheism says God doesn't exist. An agnostic says, I don't know whether God exists. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. Now, if I were to consider myself an atheist, it would be important for me to consider two questions. First, of all the knowledge available to me, of all the knowledge available to know in the universe, what percentage of that knowledge do I have? What percentage do I know? Well, I know it'd be a very small, maybe a tiny fraction of 1%. Could I even measure it? What I know is so small compared to total knowledge in the universe, it's kind of like a grain of sand compared to this entire room, or building, or city, or state, or planet. And so the second question, given the fact that I don't know a whole lot about everything that exists in the universe, is it possible that in the rest of the universe that I've never examined, there might be evidence of a personal God? If I was going to be honest with myself, given my limitations, it's very difficult for me to argue convincingly that I'm sure that God doesn't exist. It's like trying to prove a universal negative. So I guess I'd have to stop claiming to be an atheist and say I'm an agnostic, a doubter. Maybe God exists, maybe He does not. Three kinds of agnostics I'd encourage you to consider. The dogmatic agnostic, the disinterested agnostic, and the dissatisfied agnostic. Dogmatic, disinterested, dissatisfied. First, the dogmatic agnostic. This one says, I don't know if God exists, and you can't know either. But how could I claim it's impossible for anyone else to know? Other people's experience and knowledge are different from mine. Look, what if I dogmatically say, I don't know if alligators live in the Florida Everglades, and you can't know either. Now, suppose you've been to the Glades and seen an alligator. Maybe you've wrestled one. I don't know what your occupation is. I'd look foolish making a statement like that. Dogmatic agnosticism does not make sense to me. The disinterested agnostic says, I don't know if God exists, and I don't care. Now, apathy, of course, is a choice. Some people choose to be disinterested. Whatever. But personally, though, I'm more curious than that. And during a time in my life, I was a dissatisfied agnostic. I didn't know whether God existed, but I wanted to know. I was dissatisfied, so I began to look. Now, let me briefly tell you about some of the evidence that I found. I should also explain, some of you may not know this, that several years ago, Worth Carson, the pastor of this church, was up on the roof of a 2-story building doing some repairs on the tiles and the shingles, and there was nobody else up there with him, and he slipped, and he slid off toward to where he got to the edge of the roof, and he was actually hanging for dear life by the edge of the roof onto the gutter. And so he hollered down below, is there anybody down there who can help me? There was nobody there. So he looked up into the sky and said, is there anybody up there who can help me? And the clouds parted, and this deep voice said, believe and let go. Is there anyone else up there who can help me? Well, lest you doubt the veracity of that illustration, that didn't really happen, but if it had, I'm sure it would have happened just that way. What are some evidences for God? My first year in university, I encountered some people who were both very careful thinkers and also very caring people. And I enjoyed hanging around them. They were lots of fun. And I especially appreciated the fact that they seemed to accept me just the way I was. They were smart and attractive and successful, but I didn't have feel the pressure I had to impress them by a list of my accomplishments. They accepted me just as I was. Now, these were Christian students, and they said that their faith in Jesus had changed their lives. I did not believe all their God talk. I kept going back to their meetings because I was curious and because it was a good place to get a date, especially because it was a good place to get a date. I'd gone to an all-boys boarding school, so this was a little bit of heaven for me. But as I spent time around them, I remember in the springtime, they had a meeting in the beautiful Duke Gardens. And the speaker was presenting evidence. There's a picture of the Duke Gardens, a lovely place if you ever get a chance to see it. And the speaker was presenting evidences for Jesus' resurrection. And the more I listened, the more it made sense. Now, I should mention, as you've heard, in these Explore God Miami church programs, discussion groups, and so forth, you're going to have a chance in coming weeks to hear more about evidences for Jesus and the reliability of the Bible and lots of other questions being dealt with. And so I'm not going to go into great detail here, but let me just give you a taste of what I heard that day. And actually, I should also add that I'm indebted in many ways to my Jewish friends and their heritage for this information. One ancient Hebrew book describes Job, a guy who had a mess of troubles, and yet he affirmed, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that gave him hope. And as I mentioned, I didn't believe my Redeemer lived. I was a doubter. I thought maybe it was a fairy tale. And then I heard these evidences that day in the Duke Gardens. This is a summary of what the speaker said. He said, Jesus was executed on the cross and declared dead. His body was wrapped up like a mummy and placed in a tomb. The tomb was a cave that had been carved out of solid rock. A huge stone was rolled against the tomb's entrance, and a Green Beret unit of Roman soldiers was placed out front to guard against grave robbers. And all his disciples had left him and fled. Only John, Jesus' disciple, was brave enough to show up at the cross along with a few women. The disciples had basically taken off. And yet, on the third day, on Sunday morning, the stone had been rolled away, the tomb was empty, but the grave clothes were still in place. What happened? Well, the Roman guards came out with a story that the disciples had stolen Jesus' body while they were sleeping. Now think about it. How would they know who had done it if it happened while they were sleeping? Meanwhile, hundreds of people were saying they'd seen Jesus alive from the dead, and they were believing in him because his prediction of his resurrection had come true. The disciples, who were now convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead, they went all over the place telling people that he was alive and boldly proclaiming this faith, and they suffered great persecution. After Judas committed suicide, there were 11 disciples left. According to traditions, 10 of the remaining 11 disciples died as martyrs for their faith. Peter was crucified upside down. Thomas was skewered, thrust through with a sword or spear. John was boiled in oil but survived, the only one to die a natural death. Each one believed he'd seen Jesus who'd been raised from the dead. And these people said the tomb was empty. You know, attempts to explain away the empty tomb and the appearances have been made. There are many of them. I won't go into detail here. You'll hear about that later, I imagine, in some of the other speeches, and I can give you some references. But the attempts to explain them away did not make sense to me because the guard was too powerful, the stone was too heavy, and the disciples were too timid. I realized that it was true, that Jesus had successfully predicted his own resurrection. He said, they're going to kill me, I'll come back on the third day, and then he did it. And I realized that if I could trust him using that legal historical analysis that I just did briefly, if I can trust him on something like that where I can test him, then I have some grounds for trusting him in areas where I can't test him, like on the questions, does God exist? Is there eternal life? How can I know him? What did he say about that? Speaking of God, Jesus said, I and my Father are one. He said, anyone who's seen me has seen the Father. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. Jesus' resurrection convinced me that God existed. Now, there's other confirmation, the prophecies he fulfilled, his life and teachings. There are lots of excellent resources that present these evidences. Explore God Miami has a bunch of them. This church has a bunch of them. Our own website, rustywright.com, also has material that might help answer some of your questions. But so what does all this do for your daily life? My college friends told me that God loved me, but that I was separated from him by a condition of alienation. Some psychologists might call it alienation. The biblical documents I found out called it sin. It was like a condition of being unplugged from God. And they told me that God had sent Jesus, his son, to die a physical and spiritual death on the cross to pay the penalty for my sins and rise again so that I could have new life. The more they explained to me, the more it made sense. And so finally, through a simple attitude in my heart, I said, Jesus Christ, I need you. I believe you died and rose again for me. I accept your gift of forgiveness. I want you to come into my life, forgive me, and give me the fulfilling life you said you would. Now, there was no thunder and lightning. Angels didn't rise in the background singing the Hallelujah chorus. And I certainly didn't become perfect overnight. It took about 6 weeks for that to happen. No, of course not. Anybody tells you they're perfect, ask their roommate or their spouse. Believe me, I've got a long way to go. But you know, I found a peace of mind that I'd not had before. And I found a joy that did not depend on circumstances. I found forgiveness. And believe me, it is great to know that your sins are forgiven. I found a purpose in life. It was really, for me, ended up being helping other people understand this concept. And I also found that I had an inner strength to begin becoming the kind of person that I'd always wanted to be. Is there a God? Creation and conscience can get me curious. Atheism didn't seem feasible to me. I didn't want to be a dogmatic agnostic or a disinterested agnostic. Didn't feel those were reasonable. But I was a dissatisfied agnostic. And when I examined the evidence for Jesus, it pointed me to God's existence. And coming to know him personally has made all the difference. I've got a friend who's never going to leave me. Now, before I wrap up here, I'd like to mention another significant barrier that keeps a lot of folks from believing in God, and that's the emotional barrier related to pain and suffering. How could a good God allow pain and suffering? Now, next week's emphasis at the discussion groups Wednesday night, I think you said there's some they can come to. You're going to deal with that Wednesday night, discussion groups, how could God allow pain and suffering? And then also the sermon next week will be on how can God allow pain and suffering. So there'll be great things that you can learn there. But let me just give you a short personal example of how this has affected my life. Maybe it'll encourage you to return next week and get involved in a discussion group and learn more. Where is God when it hurts? Where is God when it hurts? 1996 was a terrible, terrible year for me. During the first 2 weeks of February, February 1 to February 15th, now today's the 16th, right? So 15th was yesterday. 24 years ago, these last 2 weeks, 1996, it was awful. My wife of 20 years divorced me. My employer of 25 years showed me the door, said I'd have to leave. And I had a cancer scare. Life just seemed spinning out of control. I just wondered what in the world was going on. And it was just so incredibly confusing. In the middle of that, my mentor, Bob Prohl, he's the guy who spoke on resurrection evidences that day in the Duke Gardens. He became my mentor. Wonderful guy. And he reminded me of an important statement that Paul, that former skeptic, made to his Roman friends. Paul wrote, and this echoes what the little kids were singing about earlier, he said, "And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them." And Bob said, remember, that verse hasn't been repealed yet. And you know, he was right. The pain of rejection hurt tremendously. It was terrible. I cried buckets. I hope you're getting the understanding that I did not enjoy this experience, okay? It was awful. But you know, my faith in God and my friends helped me to land on my feet and stay in the race. 4 years later, I married a wonderful woman, Meg Corpy. Godly, gorgeous, intelligent, a wonderful, wonderful partner. And my life's work gained a much wider global reach than it had before. By God's grace, sadly, cancer took Meg in 2016, almost 4 years ago now. By some reckonings, the death of a spouse can be life's greatest stress. 2.5 years later, I married my longtime friend, Babs Peterson. Some of you met her about a year ago when we were here visiting. And we married in late 2018, and we are very, very happy together. You know, divorce and firing and widowhood have made me much more sensitive to hurting people. And they've given me an emotional pipeline to people's hearts. Now, of course, my life challenges are not unique, and many have experienced far greater challenges. But I can affirm that Romans 8:28, that verse, has not been repealed yet, and that when life careens, God can help you get through it. Whatever your sorrow or pain might be right now, maybe a broken relationship or an illness, or a loved one's death, or trouble at work, or more. May I encourage you not to let that keep you from considering God. He loves you, and He wants your very best. He wants you to be fulfilled. To summarize, is there a God? How should I decide? How should you? Creation and human conscience would point toward a yes answer, that He exists. If I choose atheism, I got a problem. All that universe full of information I've never examined, or it could be evidence that He exists. Will agnosticism make better sense for me or for you? Will I or you be a dogmatic agnostic, unwilling to consider evidence, or a disinterested agnostic who doesn't care? Well, for me, the answers were no and no. As I mentioned, I'm willing to consider new information, and I do care. I was a dissatisfied agnostic. I wanted to know, and I hope you do too. So what's the evidence? Well, as I indicated, Jesus' resurrection evidence sealed the deal for me. And it helped me appreciate that He was alive and I could know Him personally. Seeing my life change and how God came through in difficult times convinced me even more. As I said at the top, I appreciate that not everybody here today is going to agree with me. And I respect your right to differ. I respect it tremendously. I encourage you to talk some more with the person who invited you, or read some more. Sit in on some of the discussion groups that are forming around these questions. I just hope it'll be really, really useful to you. Now, you know, George H.W. Bush, you remember him, Bush 41? One time he realized that he dropped his notes and he'd lost some of his notes. And for a second there, I couldn't find the last page of my notes. When it happened to George H.W. Bush, it was in the middle of his speech, and he said, well, I guess the audience is going to be happy. We'll end early. Well, I found the last page of my notes, and so it was hiding. Now, this being a church, the speaker often closes the meetings with prayer. Of course, if prayer is not your thing, please feel no pressure as I pray. You just be listening anyway, or not, which I understand and appreciate too. And I'd love to meet you afterwards to talk with you. Thank you so much for coming. Lord, I pray for each person within the sound of my voice that they will seriously consider the evidence that you exist and love them. And I ask that those who know you will be faithful to sensitively explain these things to others. I pray this in the name of the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, whom some of us call Jesus. Amen.